It's great to virtually meet all of you. By means of a bit of an introduction, I'm Alan Hopkins. I lead our sustainability strategy for EY Tax and Law in the UK. And we're here to talk today with three really interesting EY panelists about the 27th UN Climate Change Conference, or COP27, and that wrapped up on the 20th of November. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a quick intro to our panel. We'll then do a little bit of a panel session with some Q&A, and hopefully we'll also kind of get some audience participation involved, and we'll then maybe answer some audience questions as well if we've got time. So we are targeting 45 minutes for this discussion, but we'll see how we get on, see how many questions and answers we get in as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask our panelists for a quick introduction. I'm going to ask them first of all to tell me a bit about their role, and then I'm going to ask them a bit about their background that led them to that role. So if it's okay, I'm going to hand over to Tina initially, and hopefully Tina can tell us a bit about her work and how she got there. So over to you, Tina.
Super, thanks Alan, and thanks everyone for joining in. I've been looking forward to this. So you can read a little bit of blurb about what I'm currently up to. So I thought I'd focus on how I got there, and while you plow through that little bit of blurb. So my career started in comms and engagement, which led me to be involved in a few quite large, sort of big transformational program events across the world with some big brands. And I suppose about 6 years ago, started working with BMW when they turned 100 years. So they decided that they didn't want to celebrate everything that they've achieved so far, but really start focusing on how can they shape the next 100 years. And so we ran these future foresight events around the world, really thinking about, circularity, the future of mobility, and it was around, thinking about how can we create a sustainable future. And it was really that sort of, pivoted me into this, a little bit serendipity more than by design. I always wanted to do something that had purpose, that had meaning, and that's really what led me here to this point. I was asked to lead our DE&I strategy, which was a huge privilege and a huge challenge. So again, that sort of added another string to my bow, and was then asked to lead our sort of B Corp accreditation process. And for anyone that doesn't know about that, that's really helping businesses be with the sort of set framework to become a better business, really thinking about people, planet, as well as profit. And that's really how I pivoted into this space. So again, serendipity, running with purpose, chasing that as opposed to designing it. So I feel very lucky to now be here at EY, working in a central function, really running with transforming businesses to create a better working world, as our purpose statement says.
Well, thanks very much, Tina. And I'm sure there'll be opportunities for questions if people do have them about your background as we move through.
Absolutely.
As well. We'll go over to Sam now, if that's okay. So over to you, Sam, a bit of an intro, if that's okay.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Alwyn, and hi, everyone. Very glad to be here with you today. So very brief intro against my role to start, as Alwyn mentioned. So I lead on energy transition for a consulting business here in the UK. I've been doing that for several years now. Joined EY about 10 years ago, always working with sort of energy and sort of infrastructure clients in the UK and across the globe. I think I came to this topic mainly because of the sector that I work within. Might not have been the most sexy sector back then in 10 years ago when I joined, and I was always within energy, but actually over the last few years, actually also being accelerated by the COVID time, energy is being in the center as a sector of sustainability and the transition to net zero as well. Mainly because obviously their primary role that they play today. They are not the only one, but they're sort of the first one that actually had to act and make a big difference in either on the production of energy, transporting the energy, or providing the energy to the end user, being industry or each of one of us. So a lot of our clients have been coming to ask about how do they get there, how do they transition from where they are to where they have to be, especially in the UK, where it's now low to be net zero by 2050, and there is a lot of things that need to happen to get there. A lot of change in terms of their way they operate, but also the people that they have within the organization in the work they do, and how they have to to change the kind of work that they do and the skill set that they have. So a significant change, and it's where we are prime place, with all my colleagues on this call, to actually help our clients to get through that transition, which is very, very exciting to be part of. And we'll hopefully talk a little bit more about what COP27 meant for our clients, and what it is that they have to think about in the years to come.
Absolutely. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that in particular. And then just finally, over to Haslina, if that's okay. Bit of background and your role would be fantastic.
Thanks, Alwyn. I'm Haslina. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm from Malaysia originally. I moved to the UK about 3 going on 4 years ago now. My background is mostly in private equity, actually. I spent about 9 years doing private equity work before I transitioned to transaction management consulting, which is a mouthful. So most of my background has been focused on M&A and business value from that perspective. And I got into sustainability about 2 years ago now. An internal secondment opportunity came up that gave me the opportunity to lead the EY UK and I go-to-market strategy for sustainability and how we help our clients in sustainability. What are our clients' problems that they need to deal with, and what do we as EY need to do to help them with that? And I've always wanted to get into environmental and social impact. So now it's just making sure that the G is part of that as well, ESG and sustainability. And from there, I got kind of embedded in everything related to sustainability in EY, and haven't left and don't want to leave.
That's good, because we don't want you to leave either. So just then to finalize and just give a bit of a background to myself as well. So before kind of moving full-time into working on sustainability, I held a variety of different roles in the international trade space. And what I thought was quite interesting about those is that I spent a lot of time in that space working on sustainability focused projects. So they were quite kind of wide ranging, but they included things like advice on the rules of origin that apply to trade and electric vehicle components. So your kind of traditional kind of international trade advisory applied to the world of sustainability, but also things such as advising on the implications of Brexit on businesses that were impacted by the EU ETS, the emissions trading system, and then kind of latterly trying to help businesses to understand and manage the risks surrounding the upcoming EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, that's coming down the track. So something to watch out for there. And I continue to advise on that even in my current role. So before we get on to our panelists' reflections on COP, we thought it probably just worthwhile recapping some of the key outcomes of the latest COP27, just to ensure that everyone's kind of aligned on what we've seen. So as you can imagine, at a conference with over 35,000 attendees, there were many sets of negotiations, lots of conclusions, and we don't have time to cover them all. So what I've done is I've pulled out this slide, and I think on here there's kind of 5 really quite material and quite interesting kind of outcomes that are worthwhile talking through briefly, but they're certainly not comprehensive, so I don't want people to get that impression. So the first of those outcomes I thought worthwhile mentioning is loss and damage. So people have probably heard a bit about this. It's one of the headlines. And broadly what happened is the COP27 participants agreed to establish a fund for responding to loss and damage. So that's actually the technical term from the negotiation text. And when we talk about loss and damage, what we broadly mean there is the destructive impacts of climate change. As you can imagine, those impacts are disproportionately felt by developing nations. So broadly, this will eventually look like a kind of transfer of funds from wealthier nations to those perhaps in the global south. It's also worthwhile noting that this is just an agreement to establish the fund. It still actually needs to be established. So as a next step, they're setting up a transitional committee that's going to look into what funding is needed and where that money should come from. And they're going to report to COP28 on what that fund looks like and the outcomes of that transitional committee. The second thing we thought worthwhile mentioning at this point was the mitigation work program. So a bit of history on that. At COP26 in Glasgow, countries noted that emissions in 2030 were projected to be 14% above 2010 levels. In contrast, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we need to get emissions to fall by 45%. So we're clearly some way off. So what they did is they agreed to set up a work program to, and the technical terminology was to urgently scale up mitigation, ambition, and implementation. So at COP27, most of the debate was about how we structure that work program. And you'll see here some kind of compromise wording was agreed that you can see on screen. So it noted, for example, that it needs to be respectful of national sovereignty, but also not result in any new targets or goals. So to kind of translate that a bit, the nations must be given kind of autonomy on their mitigation response, but also we mustn't let our climate targets slip any further. The third kind of bucket of negotiated outcomes that I wanted to touch on here is some of the new carbon trading rules. So broadly, some of the new rules and procedures around carbon markets that were defined in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. For those of you who don't know about Article 6, broadly what it allows is countries to cooperate to meet their NDCs, which are basically their climate targets, by transferring mitigation outcomes or emissions reductions between themselves. So it's basically kind of international carbon credit trading towards nationally determined contributions. If those are the kind of three negotiated outcomes that I thought worthwhile talking about, there's also some other developments of interest to talk about that kind of came outside the formal process. So as you'll see towards the bottom here, there's been a big funding pool made available via the UN for kind of climate disaster emergent early warning systems, aiming to have those available in the next kind of 5 years. And then also as a kind of second outcome of interest, you can see at the bottom I've drawn out, under what's been termed the breakthrough agenda, countries representing, I think it's more than 50% of global GDP have set out a series of actions or priority actions they're going to take to do things such as decarbonizing power and transport, scaling up low emission hydrogen production, and also shifting towards sustainable agriculture. And that's intended to occur by COP28. Just to give you 3 examples of these, this includes things such as development of common definitions for low emission or near zero emission products, ramping up of the deployment of major sustainability focused infrastructure projects, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in this session, and also setting up a common date for the phase out of polluting cars and vehicles. So what we're going to do now, before we get on to the kind of Q&A with our panelists, is do a bit of an experiment, and this may or may not work, but we're going to try and do a word cloud, so a bit of audience participation here. You're going to see on screen here a QR code that we'd love people to scan. Alternatively, if you don't have a QR code scanner, you can go onto menti.com and enter the voting code that you can see on screen now. We might even be putting the relevant voting code in chat. So I'll ask our facilitators to do that. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask everyone, we're going to do a bit of a word cloud to answer for us on that Menti. So you'll know I'm giving you all a bit of a time to get onto the system. We're going to ask you the question, when you think of COP27, what springs to mind? So what your first thoughts are about COP27, and hopefully then what we can do is get a bit of a sense from the audience about how people have perceived that process we've just been talking about. So I'm not sure if anyone's struggling, do pop it as a question and answer or a chat, and we can try and help you get on there. Let's then hopefully our facilitators can switch us over to the word cloud and we can see what people are saying. So there we go. We're getting some stuff in there already, which is great. Reduced emissions, not fast enough. Absolutely. Going back to our mitigation program, that's certainly very true. Power and protest, very interesting. The activists getting involved, certainly. Energy trilemma. I'm not sure if anyone on our team here can talk about that, but I'm sure there's some EY folk who've got lots to say on energy trilemma. Net zero, developing nations, absolutely. When we talk about loss and damage, developing nations are certainly front and center of that. Equity, trade-offs. We're going to move on to Q&A now with our EY colleagues. What I want to make sure we can do is keep this word cloud on screen for a little bit. because then hopefully we can raise some thoughts around that as we move forward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off our first question. I'm going to ask Tina. So Tina, what I want you to tell us about, if it's okay, is some of your key takeaways from COP27, and in particular, if there was anything that surprised you about the outcomes that came from the conference.
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy. And I have to confess that whilst COP was going on, I know the midterm elections were going on. My little nephew was in hospital, and I was feeling overwhelmed with climate anxiety. Right, I was like that yellow emoji, you know, that has sort of peaks, sort of doesn't. Because, you know, in the run up, it was sort of, you know, is it going to be important enough? Are people going to pay? Is Sunak going? Is he not going? And I was just like, how can you not go after everything that happened at COP26? I was just like, I can't look because I care so deeply about what's going to happen. And will they go far enough and fast enough? That it took me about a week after to actually lean in and say, okay, well, what did they come up with, and what does it all mean? And I'm still reflecting on that, if I'm really honest, and observing all the different sort of commentary that's coming out. So surprised, maybe pleased that it was the longest COP yet, you know, and to me that means, you know, the issues are getting maybe more complex, right? You know, if we think about loss and damage, who's going to pay for that? That's a lot to talk about. That's complicated stuff, right? Where do liabilities lie? Who's involved? Who's going to pay for what? And all of these things. So you know, that was a surprise and a little bit like maybe a recognition that we're hitting really nitty-gritty stuff now. Maybe a little bit disappointing that the language around phasing down as opposed to phasing out of fossil fuels, that was a bit of a disappointment to me, that I thought, oh, well, what does that mean? Are we going to slow down? So that's my very personal sort of reflections on it. I'm certainly not a specialist in sort of interpreting these very complex texts. And I think that the last reflection, I guess, is a lot of, you know, credit to the guys that do the negotiations, right? Whether you're a COP cynic or a fan, I don't know if there's fans out there that love the concept of COP. I certainly think it's too important to be cynical about it. And I just want to cheer those guys on that sit there till the early morning hours and wade through these texts and try to make progress happen. So these were my very personal reflections on what happened at COP.
And I think what's really interesting, Tina, is some of the comments you've made there actually align with some of the content that's been coming out in our word cloud. In particular, things such as your comment on fossil fuels. So you said about the phase down. You'll see in there, we've got a comment about weak on fossil fuels. And then also you can see the biggest word in there, the biggest two words in there are greenwashing and accountability. So you talked about you know, concerns with credibility of the process. Well, I mean, if the first things that are springing to people's mind are greenwashing, clearly something needs to change.
And there's green wishing now and green wanding, and I think green wanding, or did I make that up, right? Like, what the heck?
I've not heard that one before.
I know, it's like the closer you get to all of this stuff, the more you learn and the more you realize, gosh, I know so little, right, in comparison to what is out there. So yeah.
Yeah, cool. So we'll return to you in a bit, Tina, for some more reflections. I'm going to hand over to Sam now, though. So Sam, question for you. Is there anything from your perspective to add to Tina's thoughts? I wonder whether there's any specific kind of energy transition related content that really sprung to your mind when you were looking at COP27.
Yeah, there's probably 3 points that I'm keen to highlight. But just before that, back to Tina's point, you know, I know, especially this year, the COP27, if you're sort of reading the news from the outside, it was not all positive. You know, it was a bit negative, and the tone was a bit of a, you know, there's a bit of a lack of progress, potentially. But however, my reflection is that, you know, we're becoming more and more practical now. So it obviously will be harder because we actually need to find activities and things that needs to be done that obviously cost money, and that make it hard, and therefore we feel that there's a lack of progress. But actually, we are getting into the place that we want to implement rather than just talking about it. So the first wider thinking, and the second one is, especially with last year, obviously last year because he was in the UK and there's good delay by a year and there's a lot of noise around it, but the fact that everyone is talking about it, I'm pretty much sure that several years ago no one would really know what COP meant, and now actually that more and more people, even my parents who are not in the sector at all, they will know and they will have heard about it, and just that notion that people are getting aware of what it is actually is very, very important, because it means it's going to impact, aside from actually the specific outcomes that come out of COP27. So that's sort of my second one. And the third one is, before I go to the specific that you asked, Alwyn, so apologies, I'm going around a bit. But the third one is people care about it. So I led a sort of initiative called UK Climate Business Forum early last year in 21. And we had a sort of a board of senior leaders and a board of sort of what we called future leaders, who are sort of people between in their 20s, very interested in the topic. And there's one lady, she was 22 and she had been at 5 COP already, because she cares and because she wants to make a difference. So, they're not just, a sort of a set of very senior people who just want to have a chat. They're actually a lot of people around that are very keen. And I think there was an observation about the size of some of the side events. I think the Blue Zone and things like that was much bigger than what it used to be. And actually not just the main event, but everything that is around having more and more impact. And Alwyn, you might talk about it a bit later. So that was the start. So apologies. I just wanted to give an overview, but quickly, 3 things that I think is important for industries, and I might zoom in a bit to the UK. The greenwashing that you talked about, Tina, is on the screen here. There is a clear view that it's not tolerated anymore. It's a term that exists. There is more and more emphasis on corporate sustainability and the fact that you can't just have statement, but you actually have to make a difference. And we see that a lot of my clients, as I mentioned in my intro, are coming to me and saying, well, what is it we can do? They've done their statement, they've done their sort of net zero by 2050 because they had to, but actually now they want to become real. So first one, I think that's quite critical for businesses. The second one is that's more UK specific, but what is called a TPT, some of you might have heard, the Transition Plan Task Force, is still a bit of a concept, but actually could make a big difference. And very often for those kind of things, the UK can take a lead that will drive, other developed countries, the US and others. And that's very much trying to push mainly publicly listed companies first, but actually to publish their net zero plan and to have a set of metrics and non-financial metrics in order to measure against. Still in draft mode, it's still in discussion, but actually that could make a huge difference in terms of action that companies have to take. So very much have a look, Transition Plan Task Force, watch this space, will make a big difference, I would hope, over the years to come. And I could definitely see the UK and UK companies and UK governments taking a lead globally on that point. And thirdly, and Tina, you talk about that is I would call it the future of gas. And actually, there was this view that gas is now a bit of a transition, and it's become much more preeminent. Some people might see that as a negative. Some people might see that as a positive. I'm not going to enter into that debate. But actually, the UK heavily dependent on gas. If you look at 80% of domestic heat is through gas. Let alone the industry gas needs to run still. Companies or CCGTs, for instance, to create power in the UK. That there is a huge need of gas today, and how do we transition quicker, to greener gas, for instance, but also how do we move away from not as more polluting like coal, for instance, to go to gas, to greener gas. So there's some learning here. There's a lot that can happen. A lot of investment is required. But I think that's what I'm saying. So greenwashing, the Transition Plan Task Force, and the future of gas.
Interesting. I think in particular, what fascinates me about the Transition Plan Task Force is the way that it's currently UK policy. So for those of you who aren't aware, it's this framework that's under consultation. But the way they're developing it is that actually it should, in theory, be able to be rolled out into other markets. So actually, we might see the UK acting as a bit of a spearhead on something that eventually becomes globalized or semi-globalized, which is really interesting and exciting. I'm going to hand over now to Haslina. So Haslina, I'm conscious we've just had loads of really great content from Sam and Tina. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that? Any kind of particular takeaways from your perspective from COP27, and anything that kind of surprised you about the outcomes?
So just bearing in mind that some of the things on the word cloud, I do agree with all of them, but some of the things you send out to me as things that I think as well. And some of that is like, it's platitudes, it's words, not action. It's not fast enough. But I'm going to focus on the positive takeaways from COP, because people are always going, well, you know, here were the outcomes from COP, but here's where it failed. But I think it's always kind of nice to take a step back and go like, okay, we have made progress. And I think loss and damage was a really nice outcome. I think it goes a long way towards recognizing the scale and the frequency of the impact of climate change, as well as the vulnerability that particular communities have to it. And that's the kind of thing that tends to actually, there's a conversation that happens on the side of discussions around transition to net zero and commitments and diplomacy, but really recognizing that, hey, we're in this state where we're already seeing the negative impact of climate change, and that's really affecting our communities around the world. That's, I think, a big deal. I think the progress on the breakthrough agenda as well, considering the fact that it was only established in the last COP, which was a year ago, and then now we're in a place where we have 25 commitments or workforces or what have you. I think it's a really good indicator of positive and rapid collaboration, and that's actually taking the next step from thinking about and talking about commitments on a global scale to, hey, what do we actually need to do to achieve this? And those two things, I think, well, for me, were my great takeaways. In terms of the impact of business, like, well, we'll come to that later on, I think.
You certainly will. Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. So just before we move on to the next question, and I'm actually going to ask slightly different questions to each of the panelists, just a quick word to say, we do have a Q&A box. If you've got any questions you'd like us to cover, which of course we will do our best to, especially if we do have time, then please stick them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them towards the end of the webcast once they've all started to filter in. So with that in mind, on to another question, if that's okay. I'm going to ask this one to Tina again. So Tina, my question to you, we've spoken a bit about our feelings about the kind of takeaways from COP and what it means to us. Can you talk a bit about, from your perspective, what the challenges or opportunities are that COP27 presents for business?
Yeah, I'm very happy to. So I think firstly, it's interesting to maybe look at what the relationship between COP and business is in the first place, right? COP is the Conference of the Party. And what we've seen over the last 10 years, you know, businesses moving in, 10 years ago, businesses didn't really have much to say about the climate agenda. Well, that is very different. And the same is true, I think, with COP. We're seeing businesses show up more and more and leaning into what is happening at COP. And I think at its sort of highest level, the way I look at it is that COP is like a signal to business, right? That things are changing and there's no turning back. We're seeing guidelines being published. Sam, you mentioned it. And Glasgow, we had, Rishi Sunak say, all listed business and financial institutions need to publish their transition plan to net zero. This year, we've seen them, move closer to that with the task force publishing, well, this is what a gold standard plan looks like. So giving businesses more guidelines in terms of if you want to go there, and you do want to go there quick, because the net zero economy is going to be a thing. It's not pie in the sky anymore. Then you want to move close to that. So, and like Sam said, that's not mandatory, right? There's up for consultation right now. So I think the challenge for business is to figure out what kind of business do you want to be in this context, right? Do you want to be a business that transforms to survive in a net zero economy? Do you want to be a business that transforms to comply? So when these things become law, in a net zero economy, or do you want to be a business that transforms to thrive in a net zero economy, right? And I know these are big questions, and I'm not, it's easy for me again to say, well, transition your business, how hard can it? It's tough, but I think for businesses now, it is to think about, okay, how are we going to lean into this? I think once the question of loss and damage and who's going to pay for it and all that might, become a theme. But for now, I think for us here in the UK, that is the challenge. You can look at that gold standard transition plan, which you can view, and it's really comprehensive. It gives you buckets to sort of dive into and see, okay, how does our plan compare right now? And I think it starts with that questions like, what kind of business do we want to be, and how are we going to lean in? Because government is not agile. It's going to be slow. To say this is the law is now enshrined. I think as businesses, we have an opportunity, maybe a duty, to go quicker and run with what I believe will be our future anyways, in terms of how we operate. And I guess that's then the opportunity as well. Be a forerunner, be the first one to go, because customers and people, they care. They care, as someone that works in culture, that is an epic subject for employees, for sure. It is an epic subject for customers. So I think that is the opportunity to link in now. What do you people think and feel about your transition plan and the impact you're having on your communities, on the climate? And I think from my perspective, that would possibly be the opportunities and challenges. Not thinking that's easy for 1 minute, but I think we have to start engaging in the conversation, otherwise we'll miss the trick. The boat or a trick, Being German, I sometimes get these things, I get built up. So green behind the ears, red behind the ears, I don't know.
And I think your point around kind of culture here, right, as well, in the relationship with net zero transition is really interesting, because if you look at, for example, the transition plan task force framework that we've been speaking a little bit about, the last section of that, section 5, covers off lots of comments about, how are you going to incentivize your senior management to transform things. So
absolutely,
there's really interesting relationships there with
I know. I mean, when we saw that coming out, it was definitely a sort of a celebration, because as someone that works in the sort of belly button fluff area of consultancy, let's call it that, it is so important. And obviously I have a huge conviction that is a game changer, right? So I was delighted to see it.
Absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see how that consultation plays out, because it's due to close the 23rd of February. So.
And I think it's interesting that it's a sort of an annual rhythm that we're moving closer and closer. I wonder if with loss and mitigation, it will be, obviously they set the target for it, but again, if that is our sort of time rhythm, is that fast enough? I don't know, different question.
We're going to ask a question to the audience towards the end of this as well about, I'm going to give them a bit of foreshadowing so they can think what they'd like to see in COP28. So interesting as we think about that kind of time sequencing point as well. I'm just going to hand over to Sam for a moment. So what I want to ask Sam is whether the outcomes of COP27 will actually affect the work that he's doing with his clients. So would you say that's the case, Sam? And if so, how are you going to see practical impacts, do you think?
Thank you, Alvin, and good question. So I think linked to some of the point that I raised before, are there going to be a direct impact? Has there been a direct impact to it the day after when it ended? No. Let's be sort of open and honest here in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And it's back to the point I raised around what COP27 is here to achieve. And also, I think there's an element about every country is in a different phase of their evolution. Not just between the global north versus the global south, but actually every country has a different plan to achieve that. And I still believe that the UK is trying to be at the forefront, not in everything, but in a lot of elements. I think the key element is about the level of investment. So we talked a lot about the money, and you gave that point, Alvin, in the introduction. And I was actually reading an article from the International Energy Agency a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying that we need about an additional 3 trillion to achieve actually net zero if we want to get there, in time, especially with the big climate problem where we have today. That's a huge amount of money. It's a huge amount of investment that is required. And I would say that that's probably the biggest difference, is this need to actually deploy capital. And what we see in the UK, that some of the targets that we have achieving 50 gigawatt of offshore wind by 2030, when we are at about 16, I think today, in 8 years, this is a level of capital that's never been invested in the past 30 years that needs to be invested twice more in the next 8. So that actually capital deployment for energy company, for infrastructure company in the UK, but actually is the same across Europe, it's the same in US and actually in other countries. This is significant, and they, because of the speed at which it needs to happen and the capability that is required, within the organization, to do so. And as I said, they haven't had to deploy that much capital over the last 30 years, so they might have lost some of that capability and capacity. This is where clients are asking for support, not just from us, but asking wider support in order to do that, in order to accelerate, to achieve some of the policies that the government has set for 2030, 35, 40, and 50. So I would say that that's the biggest one, is access to capital, deploying capital at speed and at scale, which is quite significant.
I think it's a really interesting point as well about when we think about making use of capital funding and financing, where businesses are looking to align themselves with policies of the nations that they operate within. So, for example, the 10-point plan in the UK, actually that can prove a real source of opportunity for accessing government funding, which can defray costs of transformation. So,
and it does. And as Lena would know much better, with a sort of PE background, but investors want certainty. So, the 10-point plan that was raised now a year ago, I believe, if I remember, 2 years ago, actually. But it's an anchor, it's a set of policies that investors want to see, because it gives the confidence they can access, they can raise capital and they will have certainty on return over 10, 20, 30 years. And obviously, as Lena will have a better position, but that's what people are looking for.
Thank you. And on to Haslina, if that's okay. So, Haslina, we've already discussed a bit about kind of the failure we currently have in climate policy at the moment, in that we are a long way off our climate targets. We kind of had that at the start when I was talking about our mitigation plans that have been agreed at COP27 to an extent. That's both from a policy perspective, though, and also a business action perspective. So my question for you is, what do you see businesses as needing to do? What does a business need to do to be successful in this environment where we are clearly, we have a long way to go in order to get on track?
Thanks, Owen, and Sam, thanks for the setup. We definitely need certainty. That's definitely one of those things. And I'm gonna adjust the question a little bit. It's what businesses need to do and what businesses need, because what businesses need to do will come after you. Well, they need the right things to be able to be successful. I think, particularly in the UK, over the next, 5 to 30 years, we're going to be in transition mode. We're going to be not quite where we need to be, but some things are going to be in progress, and that's going to create disruption. It's going to create change. And what businesses need in that period is certainty about what's going to happen. Is certainty that they're going to get the support that they need to be able to move along on that journey. And that might be it might be things like incentives, it might be taxes for the right things, it might be removing taxes for the right things, and it might be support from the government in providing or changing public infrastructure, for example, setting up EV charging stations, so that we can have a fleet of EV cars. But I think what's really critical with that is that the government needs to bring the country along on that journey. It's communication, and quite importantly, it's collaboration, because the government has set these targets for where we need to get to. But for businesses to get that, as I said, they need certain things to be able to do it. So businesses need to also have a say in that, and the government needs to work with them to understand what would actually be effective in helping them along with this journey. It's also really important to make sure that everyone's engaged. So not just big businesses, but also small businesses. It's also the communities, it's the workforce, making sure that everyone is coming along on this journey with them. Everyone knows what's going to happen, and that will also help to facilitate a just transition. And what businesses and the government actually needs to do is you need to move rapidly, and you need to be creative. So both businesses and governments will have to collaborate with stakeholders that they're not used to collaborating with new experts. So in this case, it might be like indigenous groups who have historically had generations of solutions for for being productive in collaboration with the environment, it is definitely collaboration with scientists, making sure that your approach is data-driven and fact-based, but also understanding what the data doesn't say and making sure that you don't commit to too far down a path that leads to negative outcomes. And quite clearly, they need to move quickly because we've got ambitious targets. We need to get to a transition phase in 2030 and net zero by 2050, which is not easy to achieve. And I think for businesses to really understand how they can thrive and succeed in this environment, they need to kind of change their way of thinking a little bit. They need to focus on long-term value. And that's a switch in mindset from profit maximization to value maximization. And I think, we're moving into an environment where extreme profitability is no longer the goal, and it's no longer going to be accepted by communities. So that's something that I think businesses will have to get their heads around.
Yeah. So I like what you, sorry, is that all right if I quickly bust in?
Please do.
I like what you said, Haslina, about government and business. And I was listening to a podcast just recently, and the way they describe what's going on right now brought this to life to me really beautifully. And they said, well, if this was a game, and obviously this is a very high stake game, and it's not a game, right? But if it was a game and government was the referee, they define the goal, and if the goal is 1.5, then all the players will sort of hit that goal and go after that goal. So we need that from government, right? But I think what's happening at the minute is that there's two parallel fields going on, almost parallel games. So we have government in this pitch, and then we have business activists in this other pitch, having a parallel game going on. And actually, and this is for my hope for COP28, what would it be like if we got into the same pitch together? And but I think that is just what you described, Haslina, should be our future, what we should go for as businesses, in addition, obviously, to everything else that you said.
And I think to get there as well, you talked about facilitative and certain policy, Haslina. I think as well, it's really important to note that policy is not just climate specific policy, but actually all of the policy that goes alongside it. So the example we often use is in the UK, you get a different rate of VAT on your electricity if you're charging an EV at home versus away from premises, which actually affects the competitiveness of those charging points. So that's not, specific sustainability policy, right? That's just tax policy that has an impact on the competitiveness of electric vehicle charging. So I think quite an interesting example there. Now we're going to run short on time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move us on to our next Menti question, if that's okay. And I think this has already been asked to everyone. So hopefully we've got some answers pre-populated as we start to pull open the word cloud on screen. But while we do that, I'm going to ask our panelists their response to our next question. So the next question we'd like to ask, and if you're struggling to get on the Menti, do let us know, is actually, what would you like to see in COP28? What would you like to see next year? So I'm going to first of all, kind of following our kind of circle that we've been going at the moment, I'm going to ask Tina first what she'd like to see.
I feel like I've already said it.
Oh yeah, you have.
I just want to be on the same pitch. Yes. So I think again, I'm going to go high level and philosophical because that's the place that I operate in. My hope is for people not to lose hope for COP and its purpose. And yes, it may need to pivot a little bit to get us to where we need to be, but it is the conference of the parties. We need these guys to be talking and doing this very, very difficult, important work, and park our cynicism. That would be number one. And so I want to cheer on our politicians to keep going in that sort of way. And I think given our polarized world, for our activists and our government to move closer, not further apart, because I think we need each other and to find a place of constructive dialogue. I suppose that would be my my sort of hope ahead and for COP28.
Very good. And it seems like it does align with some of what we're seeing on the word cloud. I'm going to go over to Sam now. Sam, it'd be great to hear, what would you like to see in COP28? And it might be that it aligns with what we're seeing on screen, so do feel free to call that out. So,
yeah, Thank you. I was actually looking at those, and for me, it's back to what I said in the beginning. It's going to become harder and harder, and we need to get even more practical. So I agree with Tina. We need to continue. We need to move away. That's sometimes it doesn't always go as much as we want it to in terms of the ambition, but actually, if we can get practical actions that government can take, that businesses can take. We talked about just before the importance of governments and policies. Actually, continue the discussion, continue to be very action orientated in the short term and in the medium term. I think it's important. It's a journey that we're going through. Yes, we need to accelerate, but let's continue that, being very practical and get some action out. So I think we are potentially seeing a shift of those COPs from being quite theoretical and bold statements that we have seen. Sorry, the line's going on and off here. And now, as I move my hands, it's back on. But we've seen some bold statement in the past, in Kyoto and Paris, and trying to do the same last year. But now we need to become narrow, having so specific. And I'm hoping that next year and the years to come, we'll see more and more of that.
Very good, thank you. And then on to Haslina, if that's okay.
Thanks, Alvin. I will definitely echo what Tina said. I had it in my mind that we need to have firm commitments and we need to know exactly where we're going. And those commitments need to be hard commitments, as in, I want to hear that they're committing to ending the reliance on fossil fuels, not just phasing down. And I see that on the word cloud as well. And the reason that's so important is that if this is a 20, 30-year sprint, then it's a long one. And even if you start out with very slightly divergent path, then where you end up in 20 or 30 years is going to be very different, depending on what the path is. I think it also affects the things that the businesses will be investing in, the things that communities will be investing in, on the expectation that this is what we want to happen. So, for example, investing in technology that will reduce the reliance on fossil fuels versus a completely different kind of technology that will not require the use of fossil fuels at all. I think that's incredibly important. And the second thing is I want to see them engaging more with different communities, particularly developing countries and those that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. I would like them to have a bigger voice in the direction that we're going. And the youth as well. So I see that coming out a lot in the work cloud, and that's something that we at EY firmly believe in. The youth being the future leaders of today, and in 30 years, they're going to be the ones who are inheriting the economy. So they need to have a voice in this. They need to be able to say, this is what we need, and this is what we need you to do, because otherwise we're going to inherit something that we don't want.
Absolutely, absolutely. The other thing that I've just seen on there that I don't think we've spent too much time on, but I think is really interesting, is the biggest word on there is transparency, which I think is fascinating, because if you think about some of the news reports we've heard about deals being done at COP, but those that aren't necessarily part of the negotiations, I think that's a really interesting point that's been drawn out in the middle there. So I just wanted to raise that. I can see Tina's come off mute. I don't know if she's got a...
I don't know if this is facetious, aka fossil fuel industry. I don't know. It's all right to be facetious, right?
It's probably worth remembering that the next COP is in the UAE.
Absolutely. So I'm conscious we're going to have to close this up at 5:02. So we're going to try and pull ourselves towards a close. I'm going to ask each of the different panelists if they've got any closing remarks, anything they'd like to pass on to the group before we close up the webcasts. And then I will very quickly talk through a couple of housekeeping bits and some reflections from myself as well. So if it's okay, I'm going to go to Sam because he's off mute. So I thought that I'd pick on him for any closing remarks.
Thank you, Alwyn. I was just actually, and I'm going to use that as my closing remark, but two perspectives I see on this, with the transparency is one, but the two other ones is the just transition and the youth perspective. I mean, I talked about the UK Climate Business Forum that I led last year around the youth, and there's so much ideas and desire in terms of what we can make it different, and that was what this forum was about, to actually bring, youth perspective to actually sort of draw a different decision from sort of senior leaders. So I think that's quite critical, and we should do more and more of that. think the just transition is important, and it's important in the sense that I was back a bit to the trilemma, but the transition, especially at the pace we want to get to, is not going to be cheap. But we need to make sure that it's just and equitable, across all different regions. Look at the UK is the same, but actually globally, the global north versus the global south. And we need to make sure that we make it just for everyone to get there, because we can't do that in isolation. If the UK leads the way, that's great, but actually, it's quite minor, our emission versus the global emission. So I think that's quite a critical one that everyone needs to bear in mind, is how do we get there together? Because there's only one planet in that little region, and we all have to work together towards a fair and equitable net zero by 2050.
Absolutely, thanks. So I'm going to go with Haslina next, if that's okay. Any closing remarks?
Yes, and not just in relation to COP, but I think in general in relation to this path to sustainability, and also not specific to net zero, but I think we need to keep asking ourselves, like, is this enough? Are we on the right track? And what happens if I don't do this? I think we all have it in mind that we want to have a better, a cleaner, a more inclusive world, everything that's E, S, and G. So we need to change what we're doing, how we are approaching things. And we don't quite yet know what we actually will have to be able to do that. So as we go along on this journey, we need to keep asking ourselves, is this enough? Are we on the right track? Is this the right thing to do?
Absolutely. And then finally, Tina.
And with that, Haslina, I think we're struggling the urgency camp and keeping going and looking for more. And I think to balance that out, we have to just straddle the sort of optimistic world as well, just to not get bogged down with the must do. And I guess what works for me as someone who suffers from climate anxiety every now and then, I surround myself with optimists and who kind of pull me out. And when I grow up, I want to continue to be a stubborn optimist, and that's a choice that doesn't come easy to me. And so I'll finish with a good old Brené Brown quote, that hope is a function of struggle, right? We develop hope not during the easy or comfortable times, but through adversity and discomfort. And so that is a personal endeavor I'm on while straddling Lena's keep going. What else can we be doing on a personal level, and obviously in business as well?
Great. So first of all, just a massive thank you to all of the panelists we've got here. I know Sam's got a hard stop, so he's got to go. So no problems if you've got to go now, Sam. I've just got a couple of closing remarks from myself for the group. So the first thing I wanted to say is I wanted to mention another conference that's going on at the moment. It's not getting as much press, but it's possibly just as important as COP27, and that's COP15. So you might think that doesn't make any sense. That number's lower than COP27. How is that going on at the same time? So COP15 is going on as we speak, and the reason for that lower number is because it's not a conference on climate change. It's a conference on biodiversity. So to put it very simply, global leaders coming together in Montreal at the moment to discuss a new set of goals for nature over the next decade. The reason I wanted to really briefly mention that is because it's not getting that much press at the moment, but actually the severity of the kind of biodiversity and nature challenge we face at the moment is really significant. I won't give you all of the facts. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you've probably seen me posting some of them previously, so I won't force them down your throat at the moment. But I just wanted to encourage everyone to go and have a think about COP15, have a look into what's going on there, and consider how you can integrate not just considerations from COP27 into your work, but also any kind of considerations from the COP15 that's going on into your work as well, and look at how you can engage with that. So hopefully that's been useful. If you'd like to learn more about sustainability at EY, we do have a sustainability community that you can sign up for. I'm sure some of my colleagues will share a link to that here and also on LinkedIn. Also do follow myself and any of the other panelists on LinkedIn. We aim to share lots of kind of updates and future events, so you can keep track of what's going on there. And then finally, do feel free to reach out to us directly if you've got any specific questions. We will always aim to get back to you and look to pick up a conversation there. So once again, thank you very much everyone for attending. Thanks for your participation in the word clouds. And thanks very much Tina, Haslina and Sam for their fantastic work as panelists. Thank you very much all. Cheers.
Thanks, Alwyn.
Bye-bye.